The fever had climbed so high that I could no longer feel my own hands. I was lying on the kitchen floor because the bed felt too soft, too far from something solid, and the linoleum was the only cool surface left in the house. Outside, snow was falling in thick wet sheets against the window. Inside, my mother was kneeling beside me with a damp cloth and a bowl of vinegar water, whispering in Pennsylvania Dutch that the Lord would heal me if my faith was strong enough. And my father stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, refusing to hitch the buggy, refusing to call the neighbor with a phone, refusing to do the one thing that could save my life. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. Before I tell you what happened over the next 36 hours and how I ended up in an English hospital with a doctor telling my parents I had been hours away from dying, let me introduce myself. My name is Martha, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I share the truths my community spent generations burying. I grew up Old Order Amish in a small settlement outside Lancaster County, and I left when I was 23 years old. If you want to keep hearing stories like this one, the ones nobody behind the prayer cap is allowed to tell, hit subscribe and tap the like button. And in the comments, tell me, did you know that some Amish communities still refuse modern medicine? I'm curious what you've heard. I was 19 years old when I almost died. And the part that still keeps me awake some nights, the part I have spent years in therapy trying to understand, is that I almost died inside a house full of people who loved me. People who would have given their last loaf of bread to a stranger. People who prayed over me for hours. People who genuinely believed that withholding a doctor was the most loving thing they could do. Let me explain how that's possible, because if you didn't grow up inside a community like mine, it sounds insane. And maybe it is insane, but there's a logic to it, and you have to understand the logic before you can understand the harm. In Old Order Amish theology, the body is temporary, the soul is eternal. Suffering is not something to be eliminated. Suffering is something that draws you closer to God. There's a concept called Gelassenheit, which roughly translates to yielding, submitting, letting go of your own will. You yield to God, you yield to the community, you yield to the bishop, you yield to your husband if you're a woman. And when sickness comes, you yield to that too. Because sickness is part of God's plan. To rush to a doctor, to demand intervention, to insist on saving your own life at any cost, that can be seen as hochmut, pride, the greatest sin in our world. So when I started feeling sick that December, when the chills started and the cough turned wet and heavy, and my chest began to ache with every breath, the first response in my house was not concern. It was prayer. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. Here's what most people don't understand about Amish medical practices. It's not that we never see doctors. In some communities, especially New Order or more progressive Old Order districts, modern medicine is used regularly. Children get vaccinated, women give birth in hospitals, cancer patients receive chemotherapy. But in more conservative settlements like mine, there's a hierarchy of acceptable treatment. First, you pray. Then you try home remedies passed down for generations. Onion poultices on the chest, mustard plasters, garlic cloves boiled into broth, vinegar baths to draw out fever. Then, if those fail, you might visit a brauche, a folk healer who uses powwowing, a kind of spiritual practice involving whispered prayers, the laying on of hands, and sometimes objects like coins or string. Then, only if all of that fails, and only with the bishop's quiet approval, you might see a chiropractor or a naturopath, a real medical doctor, an English doctor with a hospital and machines and prescriptions. That was the absolute last resort. And in my father's view, asking for that doctor too soon was a failure of faith. I started feeling sick on a Wednesday. By Friday, I couldn't climb the stairs without stopping to rest. By Saturday, I was coughing up something thick and rust-colored, and my mother was making onion poultices every 2 hours. The smell filled the whole house, sweet and sharp and suffocating. I remember my younger sister Rebecca standing in the doorway of my bedroom, her hand over her nose, her eyes wide. I remember trying to smile at her so she wouldn't be scared. By Sunday morning, I couldn't stand up. My mother brought me water in a tin cup, and my hand shook so badly I spilled most of it down the front of my nightgown. The cotton soaked through. I didn't even feel it. My father came in and put his hand on my forehead and pulled it back fast, like he had touched a stove. He said one word in Pennsylvania Dutch: "Heis," hot. And then he left the room, and I heard him go downstairs, and I heard the front door open and close, and I thought, finally he's going for help. He wasn't. He was going to the barn to pray. Let me tell you about Annie. Annie was my best friend growing up. We were born 3 weeks apart, baptized the same year, sat next to each other on the women's side at church every other Sunday for 19 years. Annie got sick when she was 16, a pain in her side that wouldn't go away. Her mother made her ginger tea. Her father called the Brauche, who whispered over her stomach for an hour. By the time someone finally hitched a buggy and drove 3 miles to the English neighbor's phone, Annie's appendix had ruptured. She survived, but barely. She was in the English hospital for 2 weeks. Her parents nearly lost the farm paying for it. And when she came home, the bishop visited and reminded her family that this was a lesson in faithfulness. Not a warning about waiting too long. A lesson that, even when modern medicine seems to save you, it's really God working through whatever vessel He chooses. The takeaway in our community wasn't, "We should have gone sooner." The takeaway was, God spared her. And next time, with stronger faith, maybe we won't need the English at all. I thought about Annie a lot that Sunday afternoon as the fever climbed and the room started to tilt, and my mother's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. I thought, if Annie had died, they would have said it was God's will. And if I die, they'll say the same thing about me. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. By Sunday night, I was hallucinating. I remember seeing my grandmother in the room. My grandmother, who had been dead for 6 years, sitting in the rocking chair by the window in her black dress and white prayer cap. I remember reaching for her. I remember my mother crying and saying my name over and over. I remember my father coming back in and standing at the foot of the bed, and his face was the face of a man who was watching something he didn't know how to stop. And still he didn't go for help. Because going for help meant admitting that prayer wasn't enough. And admitting that prayer wasn't enough meant questioning everything our community was built on. So he stood there and he prayed harder. And I lay there and I felt my body slowly stop fighting. What saved me was my mother. I want to be very clear about that. My mother, who had spent her whole life submitting, who had never once contradicted my father in public, who had been raised to believe that a wife yields and a husband leads, my mother saved my life that night. Around 2 a.m, when my breathing got so shallow that she couldn't see my chest moving anymore, she stood up from the floor where she had been kneeling, and she walked to my father, and she said, in Pennsylvania Dutch, "I will not bury another child." And then she walked out of the house in her nightgown and her bare feet and her shawl, into the snow. And she ran. She ran a full mile in the dark to the English neighbor's farmhouse. She pounded on their door until they opened it, and she begged them, this woman who had barely spoken 3 words of English to these neighbors in 20 years, she begged them to call an ambulance. The English neighbor's wife later told me that my mother was so cold when she arrived that her lips were blue. She had run that mile without a coat, without boots. She had not stopped to put on shoes. The ambulance came. The paramedics had to lift me onto the stretcher because I couldn't move. My father stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't come to the hospital. My mother did. She sat in the back of the ambulance in her nightgown with a wool blanket around her shoulders, holding my hand, and she didn't say a single word the whole ride. The doctor at the hospital told us I had double pneumonia. He told us my oxygen levels had been dangerously low for hours. He used a phrase I'll never forget. He said, "Another 4 or 5 hours, and we would not be having this conversation." My mother nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just nodded. the way Amish women nod when they're absorbing something too big to respond to. And then she sat by my hospital bed for 6 days while I recovered, sleeping in a plastic chair, eating crackers from the vending machine, refusing to leave even when the nurses brought her real food. When I finally came home, my father did not apologize. That's not how it works in our community. He hugged me briefly, and he said, "Gott sei Dank." Thank God. And then he went out to milk the cows. The bishop came to visit a week later. He sat at our kitchen table and drank coffee, and he told my parents that the whole community was grateful for my recovery. And then he gently, very gently reminded them that going to the English hospital so quickly might not have been necessary. That perhaps with more faith, with more patience, the Lord would have healed me through prayer alone. He didn't say it as a rebuke. He said it as guidance. He was, in his mind, helping us be better Amish. My mother stared into her coffee cup and didn't say anything. My father nodded slowly and said the bishop was right, and that next time we would have more faith. I sat in the next room listening to every word, still weak, still coughing, and I felt something inside me break that did not break when the fever was at its highest. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. That was the moment I started planning to leave. Not because of the pneumonia, not because of the 36 hours on the kitchen floor, because of the bishop sitting at my mother's table eating her bread and telling her she should have let me die with more dignity. Because of my father nodding, because of the realization that if I stayed, the next sickness, the next emergency, the next moment when my life was in someone else's hands, those hands would belong to people who genuinely believed my death was a holier outcome than my survival. I lay in my bed that night, still weak, still healing, and I understood for the first time that love and harm can come from the exact same hands, that my parents loved me, and that their love, shaped by everything they had been taught, would have let me die rather than question the system that raised them. I left 4 years later. The shunning was immediate, letters returned, phone calls unanswered. My mother, the woman who ran a mile barefoot in the snow to save my life, was forbidden from speaking to me. She obeyed. I understand why. I don't blame her. But I haven't heard her voice in almost 6 years. In therapy, I learned a phrase that helped me make sense of all of it. Coercive theology. The idea that beliefs, even sincerely held loving beliefs, can become instruments of control when they require you to choose between your faith and your survival. My therapist told me something I think about every single day. She said, "A system that asks you to die quietly to prove your loyalty is not a system that loves you. It might love what you represent. It might love what your obedience says about its own righteousness. But it does not love you, the actual living person inside the body it is willing to sacrifice." I have spent years sitting with that. I want to be careful here because I know how this story sounds. I know it sounds like an indictment of the entire Amish world, and that's not what I want it to be. There are Amish communities where this story would have unfolded completely differently. There are bishops who would have hitched the buggy themselves. There are fathers who would have run for help in the first hour, not stood praying in the barn at the third. The Amish world is not one world. It's hundreds of small worlds, each shaped by its own bishop, its own ordnung, its own balance of tradition and pragmatism. My settlement was on the stricter end. Some are stricter still. Some are far more open. I'm telling you my story, not all stories, but I'm also telling you that mine is not rare. I've spoken to dozens of women since I left who have their own version of this. The cousin who died of an untreated infection. The aunt whose breast cancer was prayed over for 2 years before anyone called a doctor. The baby who didn't survive a fever that any English mother would have driven straight to the emergency room. These stories exist. They are not anomalies. They are the cost of a system that values yielding over surviving. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. The Amish world gave me real things. A community that showed up for every barn raising and every funeral. A work ethic that has carried me through every hard year since I left. A relationship with silence and stillness and simple living that I still treasure. I am not bitter, not anymore, but I am honest. And the honest truth is that my father's faith almost killed me, and my mother's faith saved me. And both of those faiths came from the same prayer book, the same bishop, the same God. The difference was that my mother, in one moment in the middle of the night, in her bare feet on a cold linoleum floor, looked at her dying daughter and decided that love was bigger than obedience. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that decision. If you grew up in a community where your survival was optional and your obedience was required, I see you. If you were ever sick in a house where prayer came before medicine and shame came before compassion, I see you. You were not weak for wanting to live. You were not faithless for wanting help. You were a body, a real body with real needs, and those needs were sacred long before any bishop told you otherwise. Your life was always worth saving, even when the people who loved you couldn't see it. Especially then. If this story stayed with you, leave me a comment and tell me what part hit hardest. Tell me if you've ever loved someone whose beliefs nearly cost them their life. Tell me your story if you're ready, and if you want to keep hearing what really happens behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. There's still so much I haven't said. Until next time, take care of your body. It's the only one you'll ever get, and no faith worth having would ever ask you to lose it.